I watched the digital clock on the dashboard flick to 6:42 a.m., the exact time I usually stepped onto my porch. But this morning, the child safety locks clicked with a heavy, metallic thud that sounded like a prison door closing. My driver, a man I'd trusted for weeks, didn't slow down. He blew past my driveway, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. "Mark, stop. You missed it," I screamed, my hand flying to the door handle. He didn't look at me. He just accelerated, his jaw set like granite. "Emily," he said, his voice a jagged edge of ice, "if I let you out of this car right now, you won't live to see the sunset. Your neighbor isn't just watching you, he's already inside." My heart didn't just race, it stopped. In that terrifying blur of speed and shadow, I realized the man I thought was a stranger was my only savior, and the home I loved had become a meticulously crafted kill box. Before the terror, there was the hollow. My life ended on a Tuesday morning when my husband, Daniel, kissed my forehead, joked about the burnt toast, and walked out the door. He was 41. He was healthy. He was my entire world. 3 hours later, a massive heart attack took him before he even hit the floor of his office. Grief isn't a cloud, it's an ocean. You don't get over it, you just learn how to drown without making a scene. 6 months later, the life insurance was dwindling, and the silence of our suburban home was loud enough to make me scream. I took a night shift supervisor job at a downtown distribution center. It was brutal, 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., but the exhaustion was a gift. If I worked until I collapsed, I didn't have to dream about a future that was never coming. Because I had sold our car to Daniel's sister, who needed it to ferry 3 kids to school, I became a regular on a ride-sharing app. That's how I met Mark. He was a retired veteran with silver hair and a quiet, professional demeanor. Every morning at 6:15 a.m., his gray sedan would be waiting outside the warehouse. He never pushed for conversation. He just offered a steady, safe ride through the gray Chicago dawn. In a world that had become unpredictable and cruel, Mark was the only thing I could count on. I lived on a quiet street in a neighborhood where the lawns were manicured and the secrets were buried deep. Directly across from me lived Howard Blake. Howard was a nice guy. That's how everyone described him. He was an IT consultant in his mid-40s, divorced, and seemingly obsessed with his garden. After Daniel died, Howard was the first one at my door with a casserole and a sympathy card. "Anything you need, Emily," he'd say, his eyes lingering just a second too long on mine. "A woman alone, it's a lot to handle. I'm just across the street if a light bulb needs changing or if you just need to talk." I thanked him. I was grateful for the kindness. I didn't see the way he watched me from his porch every time I walked to the mailbox. I didn't see him timing my departures. I was too busy carrying the weight of a dead man's memory to notice the living shadow across the street. But Mark noticed. Mark wasn't just a driver, he was a man trained to see patterns. And Howard Blake was a very loud pattern. By the 3rd month of my night shifts, the grief brain was at its worst. I started noticing small things in the house. A kitchen chair was pulled out further than I remembered. The smell of a strange, woodsy cologne lingered in the hallway when I woke up in the afternoon. My jewelry box seemed rummaged through. I told myself I was losing it. Exhaustion, I whispered to the empty rooms. "You're grieving, Emily. You're imagining things." I didn't realize that Howard had been helping himself to my life. He had spent weeks studying me. He knew when I left, when the street was empty, and exactly which window had a faulty latch. He wasn't just a neighbor, he was an architect of intrusion. One morning, Mark picked me up as usual. I was particularly drained, my eyes burning from the warehouse lights. I mentioned, almost in passing, that I thought I was becoming forgetful because things in my house were moving. Mark didn't laugh. He didn't offer a platitude. He just adjusted his rearview mirror and asked, "Does the guy across the street always stand in his dark living room when you leave at 5:30 p.m.? I froze. "What?" "He doesn't turn the lights on," Mark said quietly. "He just stands behind the sheer curtains. Every morning I pick you up, he's there. And every morning I drop you off, he's in his driveway, pretending to check his mail. The morning of the incident began like any other. The shift had been a nightmare, a conveyor belt failure and a shouting match with a driver. I crawled into Mark's car at 6:10 a.m., desperate for my bed. We drove in silence, but the air in the car felt pressurized. Mark was checking his mirrors every 10 seconds. As we turned onto my street, I reached for my bag, ready to jump out and sprint to my front door. But as we approached my house, I saw Howard. He was standing in his yard, leaning against his mailbox, staring directly at our car. He didn't wave. He didn't move. He just stared. Mark didn't tap the brakes. He didn't even coast. He pressed the accelerator. Mark? Mark, stop. You passed it. I yelled, confused and suddenly terrified that my safe driver had finally snapped. Look at the window, Emily, he said, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and fear. Look at your upstairs bedroom window. I turned my head as we sped away. My bedroom curtains, the ones I always kept closed during the day so I could sleep, were wide open. And in the darkness of the room, a light flickered. A flashlight. He's not at the mailbox, Mark whispered. That's a decoy. Look at the man in the yard again. I looked back. The man at the mailbox wasn't moving. It was a mannequin, dressed in Howard's signature windbreaker and hat. Howard wasn't in his yard. He was in my house. Mark drove 4 miles away to a bright, noisy 24-hour diner. He sat me down in a booth and handed me his phone. His hands were shaking. I've been recording, he said. I bought a dash cam and a high-zoom lens because I knew something was wrong. He hit play on a video from 3 mornings ago. I watched in nauseating silence as Howard Blake walked across the street at 2 a.m. He didn't break a window. He didn't struggle. He pulled a key out of his pocket, a copy of my key, and walked through my front door like he owned the place. He stayed inside for 40 minutes. When he came out, he was carrying something small, a camera lens. He's been installing them, Emily, Mark said, his voice breaking. I saw him go in again 10 minutes before I picked you up today. I think he realized you were getting suspicious. I think he was waiting for you to come home today to finish it. I collapsed into the vinyl booth, the smell of cheap coffee and bacon suddenly making me retch. My home, my sanctuary with Daniel, was a hive of hidden eyes. Every time I had dressed, every time I had cried, every time I had slept, he had been watching. The police didn't move as fast as I wanted, but when they saw the video of the mannequin decoy and the unauthorized entry, the tone changed. I sat in the back of a squad car as they raided my home. I watched from the street as they led Howard Blake out in handcuffs. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't fighting. He just looked at me through the window of the police car and smiled. A thin, terrifyingly satisfied smile. He has a collection, the detective told me later, her face pale. In his basement, he had a wall of monitors. He had live feeds from your bedroom, your bathroom, even your kitchen. He had thousands of hours of footage of you. But the worst part wasn't the cameras. It was the shrine. In a hidden room behind his water heater, the police found Daniel's old watch, my wedding ring that I thought I'd lost, and dozens of photographs of me sleeping, taken from inside my own room. He had been living my life with me, a phantom in the corner of my eye that I was too broken to see. The trial was a blur of trauma. I had to sit 10 feet away from him as the prosecution played clips of the footage he'd taken. I had to listen to his lawyer argue that he was lonely and obsessed with protecting me. When it was my turn to speak, I felt the weight of every woman who has ever been told she was imagining things. You didn't protect me, I said, looking Howard directly in the eyes. His mask of the nice neighbor had completely dissolved into a blank, hollow stare. You took the only place I had left to feel my husband's presence and you turned it into a prison. You used my grief as a doorway. Howard was sentenced to 12 years for stalking, burglary, and illegal surveillance. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough to pay for the fact that I could never go back into that house again. I sold the house 2 months later. I couldn't even bring myself to pack the boxes. I hired a company to do it for me. Every time I stepped over the threshold, I felt Howard's eyes on the back of my neck. I felt the invisible lenses behind the smoke detectors and the electrical outlets. I moved to an apartment building with 24-hour security and 3 different locks on the door. It was a concrete box, devoid of the charm of my old farmhouse, but for the first time in a year, I could breathe. Daniel was gone, and now our home was gone too. But as I sat on my new balcony, looking at the city lights, I realized that Howard hadn't taken everything. He hadn't taken my life. And he hadn't taken the kindness of strangers. Mark and I still talk. He retired from driving shortly after the trial. Too much excitement for an old man, he'd joke. But he saved me. He didn't have to care. He could have just dropped me off, collected his tip, and moved on to the next fare. He taught me that safety isn't a guarantee, it's a choice we make for each other. I started a foundation called the Watchers Alert. We provide free home security audits and legal resources for women living alone who suspect they are being stalked. We teach them that instinct is just your brain processing data faster than your conscious mind can understand. If something feels wrong, it is wrong. If a neighbor is too helpful, if a room feels different, if your gut is screaming at you to run, don't stop to be polite. Don't worry about hurting someone's feelings. I was lucky. I had a driver who was a guardian. But not everyone has a Mark. Today, I am 39 years old, and I am finally starting to live again. Not just survive, but live. I still miss Daniel every single day, but the grief is no longer a blindfold. It's a part of me, but it doesn't define my periphery. I walk with my head up. I check my surroundings. I trust my neighbors, but I verify their intentions. Howard Blake is behind bars, but the world is full of nice guys with keys in their pockets and darkness in their hearts. They look for the broken, the grieving, and the tired. They think we are easy prey. They are wrong. We are survivors. And once we stop being silent, their power disappears. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever felt like you were being watched, or if someone's kindness felt like a trap, please share your story in the comments. We are stronger when we speak together. And to the drivers, the strangers, and the neighbors who actually care, keep watching. You might just save a life.